She expected a hard rancher with rules. He answered with coffee poured, a knife offered hilt first, and the softest question, "May I?" The lamp on Silas Blackwood's table cast a solitary circle of gold in the gathering dusk. Beyond it, the corners of the small cabin were deep in shadow. He sat with a length of leather in his hands, his thumb working oil into the stiff hide with a practiced circular motion that was as steady as his own breathing. The only sounds were the soft rub of his work and the hum of insects against the window screen, a testament to the oppressive summer heat that still lingered after sundown. His house was a place of deep, ordered silence. One chair at the table, one plate washed and dried on the rack, one bed in the other room, the covers pulled taut each morning with military precision. For 5 years, this silence had been his only companion, a quiet that had long ago ceased to be lonely and had simply become the texture of his life. He was a capable man, his body hard and conditioned by the demands of the land, but his movements within his own walls were gentle, deliberate. He placed the finished rein on its hook with no more sound than a sigh of leather. He checked the latch on the door and the shutters on the windows, his gaze sweeping the dark tree line, not for a specific threat, but from a vigilance that was etched into his soul. It was a ritual of containment, of keeping the world out and his solitude intact. He blew out the lamp, and the cabin was plunged into a darkness that felt absolute. In it, Silas was just another shadow, a man who had made a fortress of his quiet and forgotten how to open the gate. The next afternoon, the squeal of a tortured axle was an affront to the stillness. Silas stopped his work at the fence line, his hand resting on the post he'd been setting. A quarter-mile down the dusty track that passed for a road, a dilapidated wagon stood canted at a miserable angle, one wheel shattered. A lone figure stood beside it. He watched for a long moment, his instinct to observe, to assess, before acting. It was a woman, her posture rigid with a pride that seemed to defy her circumstance. He picked up his tools and walked toward the wreck, his stride even and unhurried. As he drew closer, he saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the fine dust coating her dark dress. A simple pine box was lashed to the back of the wagon, stark and funereal. The woman he would learn her name was Eliza Hale, did not ask for help. She simply watched him approach, her chin high, a survivor gauging a new and unpredictable element in her landscape. "Axles cracked clean through," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her gaze flickering to the pine box. "My brother. Fever took him 2 days back. We were heading for Silver Creek." Her voice was low and steady, betraying no hint of panic, only a profound weariness. Silas looked from her face to the setting sun, then back to the broken wagon. There was no fixing it here, not before nightfall. He thought of his quiet house, his single plate, his ordered world. Then he looked at her again, at the unyielding dignity in her eyes, and knew there was no choice to be made. "You can't stay here," he said. It was a plain fact. He gestured back toward his cabin, a dark shape against the darkening hills. "There's a spare room. You can take it." He didn't offer comfort or pity, only shelter. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. But as she gave a single reluctant nod, the silence of his life shattered as cleanly as her wagon's wheel. The house was not what Eliza had expected. From the outside, it was a plain, solid cabin, built to withstand the elements, not to offer comfort. But inside, it was impeccably clean, the wood floors swept, the few possessions neatly in their place. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and clean linen. It was a house that was cared for. Silas showed her to the spare room, which was little more than a cell with a narrow bed and a small washstand. He placed her worn satchel by the door. "The well is out back," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll see to your brother." He left without another word, closing her door softly behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place should have felt like a cage closing. but instead it felt like a boundary being respected. She was alone, but she was safe. That first night she lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. The creak of the floorboards as he moved about the main room, the scrape of a chair, and then a profound silence. He was a quiet man, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, yet she was acutely aware of him on the other side of the thin wall. The next morning she found a pail of fresh, cool water waiting outside her door. It was a small, unspoken gesture, but it felt significant. It was a provision, an act of service. She decided then that she would not be a burden. She would earn her keep. She ventured into the main room, which served as kitchen, workshop, and living space. Silas was gone, likely already out on his land. She found flour and salt, and with a small store of dried apples from her own supplies, she baked. The work of her hands was a comfort, the familiar rhythm of kneading dough, a way to reclaim a piece of herself. When Silas returned at midday, the cabin was filled with the warm, sweet scent of baked goods. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze taking in the tidy kitchen, the loaves cooling on the counter. His face was unreadable, a mask of stoicism. For a moment she feared she had overstepped. He walked to the wash basin, pumped water, and washed the dust and sweat from his hands and face. Then he turned, picked up a small loaf, and broke it in half, offering a piece to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it. His hands were calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly light. "Thank you," he said. The two words held more weight than a whole speech. In the shared act of breaking bread, a fragile truce was struck in the quiet of the small cabin. Silas found himself watching her. It was a habit born of a lifetime of solitude, of scanning his surroundings for predators or shifting weather. But now his focus had narrowed to the woman, who moved with quiet purpose through his home. He watched the way her hands, surprisingly deft, mended a tear in one of his shirts, the stitches small and even. He watched the line of her back as she bent over the stove, the firelight catching the stray strands of hair that had escaped her bun. He had never had another person in his space for long enough to learn their rhythms. Eliza's were as quiet and contained as his own, but they were a different sort of quiet one of resilience, not retreat. She never spoke of her past, of the life that had led her and her brother down that dusty road. But he saw the story in the careful way she handled her few possessions, in the pride that stiffened her spine. One afternoon he noticed her travel trunk, a battered thing of wood and cheap metal, sitting by her door. The leather handle on one side had torn away. He took it to his workbench while she was outside, drawing water. He found a scrap of good, sturdy leather, cut it to size, and worked it until it was supple. He affixed it with small, neat rivets, his movements precise. He was not a man of easy words, but he could speak through the work of his hands. He could mend what was broken. He could make things strong again. He put the trunk back before she returned, the new handle dark and strong against the scuffed wood. He never mentioned it, and she never asked. But later that evening, as the heat finally began to break, she approached him as he sat on the porch step. She held out a tin dipper of cool water from the well. He took it, his gaze meeting hers over the rim. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not gratitude, exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition. It was a silent conversation, an exchange of deeds for deeds, of care for care. The water was the coolest, sweetest thing he had ever tasted. The loneliness he hadn't even noticed for years began to feel sharp, a hollow space that he was only now realizing he wanted to fill. The trust between them grew not in words, but in shared space and quiet acts. It was a structure built of small, solid things, the way he learned to leave the coffee pot on the stove for her in the mornings, the way she learned he liked his stew with more pepper. The thin wall between their rooms became less of a barrier and more of a membrane through which they could sense the other's presence, A soft cough, the rustle of turning a page, the sigh of someone settling into sleep. One night, the yip of a lone coyote escalated into a frantic, howling chorus, unnervingly close to the cabin. Eliza, who had been darning a sock by the fading light of the lamp, flinched, her needle pausing in mid-air. Silas was cleaning his rifle at the table, his movements methodical. He didn't look up, but he stopped his work. He didn't offer a platitude. No empty. It's nothing to worry about. He simply remained still, a silent, grounding presence in the room, until the howls receded into the distance. Only then did he resume wiping down the barrel of the gun. A few moments later, he rose and walked to her room. He stopped at the doorway, not entering. He was holding the small knife he kept on his belt. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool, well used and cared for. He held it out to her, the polished wooden hilt facing her, the blade pointing safely toward himself. "For peace of mind," he said, his voice a low murmur. She looked from the knife to his face. Offering a weapon like this was an act of profound trust, an admission of her right to her own safety, her own power. It was not the gesture of a jailer, but of a guardian. She took it, the wood warm from his grip. Her fingers closed around the hilt. "Silas," she said, and the sound of his name, spoken softly by her for the first time, hung in the air between them. It was a simple acknowledgment, but it felt like the turning of a key in a lock. That night, she placed the knife on the small stand beside her bed and slept more soundly than she had in months. A summer storm broke the oppressive heat of the long weeks. It came on suddenly, the sky turning a bruised purple gray, the wind rising to a mournful howl. Rain lashed against the cabin in violent sheets, driving them both inside and making the small space feel even more intimate. Silas secured the shutters, the sharp crack of the wooden bars sounding like rifle shots against the roar of the storm. Eliza lit a second lamp, and the cabin was filled with a warm, wavering glow that pushed back the churning darkness outside. The world was reduced to this single safe room. He took a seat at his workbench, the familiar task of oiling a harness, a way to anchor himself. She sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, a mending basket in her lap, though it was too dark to see the fine stitches. For a long time, the only sounds were the storm and the soft creak of her chair. It was a comfortable silence now, layered with a new and palpable awareness. He watched the lamplight trace the curve of her jaw, the serious set of her mouth. He found his gaze drawn to her hands, resting in her lap. Strong hands, capable. He noticed a single piece of white lint on the dark fabric of her sleeve, a small imperfection in the tidy picture she presented. The impulse to reach out, to smooth it away, was overwhelming. It was an urge entirely separate from practicality or need. It was simply a desire to touch. He put down the harness. He rose and crossed the small space between them. She stopped rocking, her eyes lifting to meet his. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand and paused, his fingers hovering an inch from her arm, his question unspoken, but perfectly clear in his gaze. He was asking for permission. A small, almost imperceptible nod was her answer. He let his fingers brush against the wool of her sleeve, his touch feather-light as he plucked away the stray piece of lint. A current, as real and powerful as the lightning outside, passed between them. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first time they had touched by choice, for no reason other than a shared, unspoken desire for closeness. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, something had shifted irrevocably. The air was still, heavy with a new and delicate possibility. The trip to town was a necessity. Supplies were low, and Silas needed to sell a few cured hides. For Eliza, it was the first time she'd left the relative sanctuary of the ranch since her arrival. The town of Redemption was little more than a dusty street lined with a handful of false-fronted buildings, but to her it felt loud and exposed. People stared. A single woman in the company of a reclusive rancher was fodder for gossip. Silas seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the curious glances. He moved with his usual quiet purpose, his presence beside her a solid, reassuring shield. It was in the general store that the outside world intruded. A man with a florid face and an overly fine waistcoat turned as they entered. His eyes, small and assessing, passed over Silas with dismissive contempt before landing on Eliza with a proprietary gleam. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality. "I didn't realize you had company." He tipped his hat to Eliza. "Bartholomew Croft, at your service, madam." He ignored Silas entirely, directing all his attention to her. "A lady of your quality must find the rustic life trying. I happen to have an opening for a housekeeper. A respectable position, with comfortable lodgings." The offer was coated in a layer of meaning that made Eliza's skin crawl. This was the kind of man she had spent her life trying to escape, one who saw women as objects to be acquired, vulnerabilities to be exploited. She felt a chill despite the summer heat. "I am not seeking a position, Mr. Croft. Thank you," she said, her voice cool and steady. Croft's smile tightened. "Every woman seeks a secure position. Perhaps you simply haven't found the right one." Before he could say more, Silas stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, but enough to place himself in Croft's line of sight. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His quiet, unmovable presence was a statement in itself. He met Croft's gaze, and for the first time, Eliza saw something other than stoicism in his eyes. It was a cold, hard stillness, a warning as clear as a drawn weapon. Croft's bluster deflated under that silent weight. He offered a curt nod and moved away. The journey back to the ranch was silent, but the air in the wagon was thick with what had not been said. The fragile peace of their shared solitude had been breached. 2 days later, Croft's buggy appeared at the end of the track. Silas saw it from the barn, and his hand tightened on the handle of the hay fork. He had known the man would not be so easily deterred. Entitlement was a kind of stubbornness. He met Croft in the yard, positioning himself between the buggy and the cabin door. "Croft," Silas said. It was a flat statement of fact. "Blackwood," Croft replied, climbing down. He held a bottle of what was likely overpriced whiskey. "A neighborly visit. And to speak with Mrs. Hawley." "Miss Hawley," Silas corrected, his voice low and even. "And she's occupied." Croft's condescending smile didn't falter. "I'm sure she can spare a moment for a business proposition." He made to step around Silas toward the house. At that moment, the cabin door opened and Eliza emerged, a basket of mending in her hands. She paused on the step, her expression serene, though Silas could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. Croft's face lit up. He ignored Silas completely, as if he were a fence post. "Miss Hawley, a pleasure. I was just telling your employer here that I wish to renew my offer. A fine woman like you shouldn't be wasting away in a place like this." He gestured dismissively at the clean, well-kept ranch. Before Eliza could respond, Silas took one quiet step to the side, placing himself squarely between her and Croft. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply became a wall. The stillness around him was immense, a physical force. "Her answer is her own," Silas said, his gaze locked on Croft. "And she is in my protection." He spoke the words with a calm finality that allowed no room for argument. Then, for the first time in front of another, he used her name, not as a label, but as an anchor. "Eliza." The sound of it, spoken in his deep, quiet voice, was a declaration. It was not a claim of ownership, like Croft's, but a statement of alliance. It named her as a person to be defended, not a prize to be won. Croft's face mottled with fury. He was a man used to getting his way through bluster and veiled threats, and he had no tools to deal with this quiet, absolute refusal. He sputtered for a moment, then turned on his heel, climbed back into his buggy, and left in a cloud of furious dust. Silas did not watch him go. He turned to Eliza. The yard was silent again, the tension slowly draining out of the air, leaving something else in its place. A bond, tested and proven true. That evening, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The confrontation with Croft had changed things, drawing a line in the dust. A choice had been made, but it had been Silas's choice to protect. Eliza knew another, more important one, still needed to be spoken aloud. She found him on the porch, leaning against a post, his gaze fixed on the first stars, pricking the deep indigo of the sky. The familiar scent of his leather and wood smoke world was a comfort. He didn't turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "for what you did today." He gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes still on the horizon. He was not a man who understands the word no. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of shared routine, but a space heavy with unspoken feelings, with the future of this fragile thing they had built between them. She knew he would never ask her to stay. His quiet respect for her autonomy ran too deep. He had opened his home to her out of necessity, protected her out of decency. But to invite her into his life, that was a boundary he would not cross unless she led the way. She had to be the one to be brave. She drew in a breath, the scent of the dry summer earth filling her lungs. "Silas," she said, and his name was the only sound in the vast stillness. He finally turned his head, his profile silhouetted against the last vestiges of light. "I have no wish to go anywhere," she said. The words were simple, but they were the truest she had ever spoken. They were not a plea for shelter, but a declaration of belonging. This quiet man, this quiet life, it was the home she had never realized she was searching for. He turned fully then, his face cast in shadow and the warm lamplight spilling from the open door. For the first time, his expression was completely unguarded. The stoic mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, wondering vulnerability that stole her breath. He saw her. He truly saw her. And in his eyes, she saw her own yearning reflected back. Her words landed in the center of his chest, a quiet weight that settled everything. All the unspoken longing, all the careful, measured distance he had tried to maintain, it all dissolved in the simple truth of her statement. "I have no wish to go anywhere." He had built this life to keep the world at bay, and now the only part of the world he wanted was standing on his porch, offering to stay. He pushed off the post and closed the small distance between them. The air grew thick, charged with the energy of a storm about to break. He lifted his hand, the callous tips of his fingers remembering the brief, electric brush against her sleeve. He stopped, just shy of touching her, his hand hovering in the space between them. His gaze was a question, a plea, a promise. "May I?" She gave the slightest lean forward, a movement of pure trust, closing the final inch. Her cheek met his palm, and the contact was a brand. Her skin was soft, warm. He felt the tremor that ran through her, or perhaps it was his own. His thumb stroked the line of her jaw, a slow, reverent gesture. He had defended his home. Now he was offering it. "This is your home," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "If you'll have it." It was not a command. It was an invitation, freely given. Her answer was not in words. It was in the way her eyes fluttered closed, the soft sigh that escaped her lips. It was in the way she lifted her face to his. He lowered his head, his movements as deliberate and careful as they were in all things, and met her lips. The kiss was not one of hungry passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and silent meals, of shared warmth by the fire, of a future sealed not by law or society, but by a quiet, open choice. It was a vow made in the summer dusk, a promise of belonging. He drew her closer, and for the first time in a very long time, Silas Blackwood was not alone in his fortress. He was home. Eliza woke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering through the window of Silas's room. She was alone in the bed, but the pillow beside her still held the impression of his head, and the sheets held his residual warmth. She lay for a moment in the quiet, a sense of peace settling deep in her bones. This was not the anxious waking of a traveler in a strange place, but the slow, easy surfacing of someone who was exactly where they were meant to be. She slipped out of bed, pulling on one of his shirts that lay folded on a chair. It smelled of him, a clean, earthy scent. She found him in the kitchen, his back to her, stoking the fire in the stove. He moved with the same steady economy she had come to know so well, but there was a new ease in his shoulders, a lightness to his presence. He must have heard her, but he didn't turn until he had the coffee pot settled over the flames. When he did, his eyes met hers, and a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. It transformed his stern features, warming them from the inside out. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He simply turned to the cupboard, took down a second her mug, and placed it on the table beside his own. The domesticity of the act was more intimate than any passionate declaration. It was an acknowledgment of a new reality, a new routine. He poured the coffee, the dark, fragrant steam rising between them. He pushed her mug toward her and sat down. She took the seat opposite him, her hands wrapping around the warm ceramic. He reached across the small table and laid his hand over hers. His touch was warm and solid, a silent confirmation of everything that had passed between them. "You slept well," he said. It was a statement, but it held a question too. "Are you well? Are you comfortable? Are you still certain?" "Yes," she said, her voice soft. Her gaze held his. "I did." In the quiet of the morning, with the coffee brewing and their hands linked on the warm wooden table, the house was no longer just his. It was theirs. Weeks turned into a month, and summer began its slow fade into the golden hues of early autumn. The rhythms of the ranch had changed, expanding to hold two people. The silence was different now, punctuated by the murmur of conversation, the sound of Eliza's humming as she worked in the small garden she had planted, and on rare occasions, the startling, lovely sound of her laughter. Silas found that his own solitude had not been broken, but transformed. It had become a shared quiet, a peaceful companionship that asked nothing more than presence. He was mending a fence at the far end of the pasture, his movements sure and practiced. The sun was warm on his back. He saw her walking toward him from the house, carrying a pail. The sight of her, her dark dress moving against the tall, dry grass, made something in his chest ache with a feeling so potent it was almost painful. It was a fierce, protective joy. She reached him, her face flushed from the walk, and offered him the dipper of cool water. He drank deeply, his eyes on her. It was the same gesture she had made all those weeks ago, but now it was an act not of tentative offering, but of established intimacy. She waited patiently, her hand shading her eyes as she looked out over the land. His land, their land. He watched her walk back to the house, their house, and felt a sense of rightness, so profound it was like settling a bone into its socket. That evening, after the chores were done, he sat on the porch, a small block of pine in his hands. He'd been working on it for weeks in stolen moments, the sharp, clean scent of the wood a constant companion. He worked the last, finishing strokes with his knife, smoothing the curve of a wing, the tilt of a head. He found her by the hearth, reading by the firelight. He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a small, exquisitely carved bird, its form simple, but so full of life it looked as if it might take flight. It was not a grand or expensive gift. It was a piece of his time, his attention, his heart. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, warm wood. She looked from the bird to his face, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I'll stay," she whispered, not as a new decision, but as a reaffirmation of the vow they'd already made. He reached out and took the hand that wasn't holding the bird, lacing his fingers through hers. "I know," he said. His voice was quiet, but his words held the unshakable certainty of a future sealed not by grand pronouncements, but by the steady, gentle work of two hands building a life together.